Hello, friends. This is Professor Guglov. On my channel, you mostly watch videos about the beautiful world around us. But today, it's a little different. What is it about? Keep watching to find out. Disaster at Baikonur, October 24, 1960. On October 24, 1960, the new R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile exploded at the Cosmodrome in preparation for its first test launch. The Soviet leadership was pushing the developers due to the escalation of the Cold War, plus, traditionally, it was necessary to brag about another achievement on the anniversary of the October Revolution. Khrushchev and Brezhnev personally inspected the progress of work. Under these circumstances, at their own risk, the military took the unfinished rocket to the site. The rush led to a gross violation of safety techniques and huge casualties. There were casualties, among them the chief of the Strategic Missile Forces, Chief Marshal of Artillery Mitrofan Nedelin, who was sitting in a bunker just a few meters from the foot of the missile, actually the closest. Movie cameras captured a horrifying picture. From the rocket in circles, waves of flame were spreading, devouring everything in its path. According to documents found in the archives 55 years later, Marshal Nedelin was identified by his physique and height, as well as by the gold star of the hero found nearby, his wristwatch and a remnant of the marshal's tunic with general's buttons. As always, the tragedy was strictly classified, but to somehow explain the death of the chief of the Strategic Missile Forces, invented a plane crash in which Nedelin allegedly died. He was buried with honors at the Kremlin wall, while the other victims were buried secretly in cemeteries in different cities and in a mass grave at Baikonur. The ramming of a residential building in Novosibirsk, September 26, 1976. Early Sunday morning, 23-year-old civil aviation pilot Vladimir Surkov hijacked from the local airfield in An-2, on which he usually carried passengers, circled over the city at low altitude and suddenly pointed it directly at a residential 5-story building. Korn, although light, crashed into the house at a speed of more than 150 km per hour. Smashed a 2-meter hole between the 3 and 4 floors in the area of the stairwell. Its front part with the propeller and the engine flew into one of the apartments. The wreckage of the fuselage and tailpile collapsed outside at the entrance. The kamikaze was killed on impact. Airplane fuel spewed out right under the apartment doors, and the entryway was engulfed in flames. Residents jumped out of windows in terror, throwing children, who were caught downstairs by neighbors who came to the rescue. There could have been more casualties if the plane had rammed into the apartments themselves, but it dodged a poplar tree near the house and eventually crashed into the entranceway. As it turned out, the young suicide bomber was aiming for the apartment on the 3rd floor, where his wife's parents lived and where she left him after taking their 2-year-old son. According to Surkov's calculations, all 4 of them should have been peacefully having breakfast in the kitchen when the retribution would fall on them. But on this particular day and hour, none of them were home. It is suspected that the pilot's father-in-law, or all of the adults, knew about the impending retaliation and took care of their own salvation, but did nothing to protect the others. However, immediately after the incident, the father-in-law rushed to save the property. It was said that he was running around the yard in his underwear. Later, fearing reprisals and hiding from the curious, the surviving family changed a dozen addresses, so that their trail was lost. The Khrushchev building was quickly cleared of the ramming and fire, and the incident was classified. It was never officially reported anywhere, and instead, ominous rumors spread through the city whether it was terrorists unprecedented in the USSR, or a gruesome, political action. In the end, the story would have become a fable, and the eyewitnesses would have been considered crazy, if it hadn't been for the KGB archives declassified in the early 90s. Escalator collapse in the Moscow subway, February 17, 1982. The worst accident in the history of the Moscow metro occurred at a Via Motornaya in the evening rush hour, when people were starting to return from work. On one of the escalators, the right handrail slipped off, apparently due to defects in construction. At the moment when the handrail almost stopped, the staircase itself, accelerating under the weight of passengers, went down. The emergency locking device cut off the engine, but neither the service nor the emergency brakes worked properly due to their improper setting and maintenance. Some of the passengers rushed up the steps in panic, against the escalator's motion, crashing into those who were trying to stay on their feet. People fell, flying downward, where a debris field had formed. Hearing the screams below, the upper ones jumped on the balustrade in horror, tried to get to the next escalator, but the plastic covering, only 3 mm thick, broke under their weight and they fell under the balustrade. However, contrary to the horrible rumors, no one was pulled into the mechanisms. People were injured due to the crush, falling from height and contact with the sharp edges of broken structures. Shoes, clothes, and bags were pulled under the metal comb of the frenzied escalator. The steps cracked and broke, stood on their haunches. People got cuts, hence, puddles of blood, which, according to scary stories, were so embedded in the floor that grandmother cleaners could not mop them up, no matter how hard they tried. All this went on for almost 2 minutes, until finally the escalator mechanisms were shut down manually in the machine room. In the crush, 30 were injured, some left disabled. One victim, whose leg was trapped between the exit platform and a step, waited another 2 hours for tools to be found to free him. A short report was furtively published the next day by Vechernaya Moskva, not even under the headline, Incident, but simply and impersonally, Information. Since the tragedy was not covered by the media, it quickly became a mythical story and turned into an urban legend. People recounted terrible details about the bloody meat grinder that did not really exist, and some media later wrote about dozens, and even hundreds, of victims. Fortunately, even during rush hours, the capital's subway was not as crowded then as it is today. After the next partition of Poland took place in 1939, the Soviet Union got not only part of its former territories, but also about 500,000 captive Poles. The Soviet authorities handed over most of them to the Germans, while the rest, about 40,000, were sent to camps. However, in 1940, when the Kremlin was already aware of the possibility of war with Germany, Beria raised with Stalin the issue of too many Polish officers, former intelligence officers and nationalists. Such an army of prisoners could be a real gift to a potential enemy, so it was decided to consider their cases in a special order and, if necessary, to use firing squads. In fact, this decision of the Kremlin, Bonzes, became a sentence for 25,000 Poles. In the spring of 1940, in groups of 350,400 people, they began to be taken to the Katyn forest and ordered from above in front of a huge ditch dug in advance. Later, the USSR quite successfully shifted the blame for these mass shootings to the Nazis, denying its involvement in this tragedy until the 90s. And, interestingly enough, thanks to their intelligence services, the United States and Great Britain knew from the very beginning what really happened in the Katyn forest. However, not wishing to spoil relations with the USSR, both Churchill and Roosevelt did not give the received data a course. Things started to come out much later, and then it was time for the country to recognize that it too had pages in its history that could be called shameful. A collision over Dniprodzerzhinsk. One of the biggest airplane crashes occurred on August 11, 1979 in the sky above Dniprodzerzhinsk, today Kamenskoye. As a result of air traffic controllers' error, Tu-134 planes, flying 7,628 Chelyabinsk-Chisinau and 7,880 Tashkent-Minsk, collided at an altitude of 8,400 meters. 178 people died, all passengers and crew members, including the Uzbek soccer team Pakhtakor. It was because of the death of the soccer team that the disaster could not be completely silenced. A short article about the death of the players was published in the newspaper, Sovetski Sport, but in the West the story received a lot of publicity. Friends, don't hesitate to write comments under the video about what else you would like to learn. I will definitely fulfill your wish. Bye for now.